Hey, welcome back once again to the Painfully Honest Tech Podcast, the podcast so honest it hurts. My name is Jason T. Lewis, the Jason T. Lewis, and I am the person who runs the Painfully Honest Tech channel, and so that's why it's the Painfully Honest Tech Podcast. We also have our host, co-host, Mr. Adam Matlock of the Tech Odyssey, another fine YouTube channel, and so this week we are going to talk about
angry things.
iMessage and beeper are the two things that we're going to talk about this week.
And
well, we're talking about them together, and then we might talk about some AI. Then we might talk about some other stuff that annoys us. It's just, like we got to get all the vitriol out of our system before the holidays come.
Yeah, so we can be happy.
Yeah, this might be the last episode of the year for the podcast, because I think I might take these next couple of weeks off because I'm tired, man. I'm tired.
It's that time of the year, man. We've been running the rat race all year, and
yeah,
all these people causing anger issues over trying to steal iMessages on their Android phones.
I know.
Grabbing them out of the ether.
It's it's kind of funny, but yeah. So if you're here for the first time, welcome. If you've come back again, I don't know why.
Punishment.
Yeah. Thanks for showing up again. I hope you find something better to do with your life than listen.
But you can do that while you listen to the podcast.
That's right. We are both on the YouTube with the audio and video, but also on the audio. Although I have noticed that for some reason the audio, like, I of course subscribe to the podcast because I want to know if it actually shows up.
Plus, you're going to lead by example. I mean,
yeah.
How can you ask somebody to follow your podcast if you don't follow it yourself?
Yeah, but it's not showing up because it was there once before, and then I tried to just restart it, and it's not populating. So I'm going to have to get in touch with our podcast host and figure out what's going on with that. We'll start the year with like audio and video and audio, and then we'll take over the world. So
yes, one step at a time.
Yes, and so basically, we've got all kinds of merch that you can check out. We've got links in the description below. If you want to check out Adam's channel, that's linked down in the description below as well. I use StreamYard to get this thing going, and I have a StreamYard affiliate link down in the description below. If you want to get on the internet and live stream yourself to people and all that kind of thing, StreamYard's a great way to do it. So yeah, let's get started here and talk about this thing that's been going on around the tech space. iMessage has always been a little bit of a sore spot with people who don't have an iPhone,
for many reasons.
But see, so many of the reasons are reasons that I don't understand. And I'm going to kind of chalk this up to the inferiority complex that so many Android users have, but don't admit that they have, about iPhones. Like, iPhone is the biggest selling platform, has the biggest part of the market share here in North America. And this, we talk mostly about North American issues because, like, we don't live elsewhere, and I can't speak with any kind of real knowledge about, like, how this works in India, Pakistan, China.
It's funny though, every time we get on these arguments, so people from across the pond are always like, "This is uniquely an American issue. We all use WhatsApp, and nobody cares."
yeah, and I mean, I use WhatsApp for talking to people who I'm in contact regularly on who are not North American, but I feel like I remember years ago trying to be in group chats with people, and somebody would be on an Android phone, and like, it was a problem. I'm either too old or too unpopular to be on any group chats anymore.
Yeah, I'm in not very many of them, but I care so little about this issue. I don't even know which one is the green bubble and which one is the blue bubble. Like, I just send a message, and if you get it, then you get it. But I'm also going to be 40 next month, and I'm not hip with the kids.
So this is the irony, and I have to think that this was planned out. So the blue bubble is iMessage, but the icon for Apple's messaging app is green.
Yeah.
The same green that the green bubble is. So, I mean, I get it's contrasting colors and it looks better from a design standpoint. I get it. But what I don't understand is why the green bubble, the green icon for that, and then the green icon for the for FaceTime, and then WhatsApp's the same green. I'm looking at them right here. That's all the same. A little bit of differentiation, but besides iconography. But so there's been some discussion lately about getting iMessage on Android.
And there's been a couple different avenues because a lot of people think that like the EU is going to force it for standardization purposes. And then we had like, what was it, Sunbird or some, I don't know. There was some platform they were talking about earlier at the beginning of the year. And then Beeper, of course, comes along. And we're not talking about the 1990s pager Beeper.
No, I don't even know if they know that exists.
Some people, like 3 people listening to this podcast, probably know, like, oh, why were you trying to iMessage on Beepers? But like my mom, if she actually, my mom listens to this podcast
on her Beeper.
Yeah, on her Beeper on her iPhone. But yeah, so there's a software, it's an app called Beeper that people have been all excited about because they were able to finally send messages back with people basically emulating iMessage on an Android phone. And it worked for like a day, and then it kind of got shut down on the back end temporarily somehow, I guess maybe by Apple.
From what I understand, and I don't know exactly how true this is or how it works exactly, but I guess the folks at Beeper were using an exploit in the code of iMessage to hijack the iMessage, and then
messengers.
And so Apple gets wind of this, they figure out what they're doing, and then they shut it down. So it's like, okay, within 24 hours, and they shut it down. And Beeper, not only are they like hijacking the signal, right? They're charging people money to use the app. Like they hadn't even really proved that it was like something that they could be an ongoing service, right? They just they're like, hey, it costs $8.99, or I think it was $8.99.
Wow,
to use this service, and then, but they were clearly, it's like charging people for like your ham radio feed, right? It's like we just grabbed this and we're using it, and now you got to pay us.
I mean, that's very rich tradition in the United States. Like take something that's not yours and then charge people money for it for access.
Yeah, and that's a lot of people's argument against. So I look at what Beeper's doing as like a theft of Apple's intellectual property, right? Apple has a proprietary protocol that they use for messaging within their system, and Beeper has found a way to exploit that and take it on for themselves and serve it to other people who aren't part of Apple's ecosystem. So to me, that's theft. I've had other people say, well, it's only theft until they get convicted of it because it's not officially a crime.
I really hate that argument. People are like, well, it's only bad if you get caught kind of argument. But there is a legal foundation with precedent that supports being able to reverse engineer something to be able, like if you validly have access to a platform or software and being able to reverse engineer it, you can do that. So it seems like they've somehow reverse engineered part of the process. So I think that they have a leg to stand on there. It's like not so much theft, but it does get kind of dicey, I think, when you start talking about charging $8 a month for, maybe you could split some hairs there. But I mean, I don't think what they did is inherently wrong, because I mean, you can do that. You can reverse engineer stuff. But I don't know. It just doesn't set right with me.
The reasoning behind iMessage to begin with, it's end-to-end encrypted, always been more secure, didn't have to go out in the air. It was like devices were connected one to the other. It happened at a time when SMS was the only other means for messaging, and SMS was very limited and very unsecure, right? So that was iMessage 10 years ago or more. Now, RCS is something that Android phones have. It basically works with the same principles as iMessage. It's more secure, like iMessage is. Adam is actually an attorney, so we can talk about this stuff, and it can kind of have a basis in fact. Although he would like to offer this disclaimer.
Yeah. So just so you know, yes, I am an attorney, but this is not anything that can be construed as legal advice. It's not what this is. Just generally, based off my limited knowledge that from some that I'm reading in a class that I took about intellectual property and patent law and things like that. From what I've seen, there is an argument to be made for reverse engineering possibly being legal in this instance. I mean, there are some exceptions to it, but it's not something that's not out of the complete norm. So, I mean, maybe they might have a leg to stand on, but I'm not giving you legal advice on that. Just generally explaining.
It feels like even though there might be precedent for it, this could be potentially for. I would see it as sort of a gray area that would have to be adjudicated. To really,
it's so weird to me, and it's also like there's an air of concern because we've been told for so long that iMessage end-to-end encrypted and it's supposed to be so secure. How are they grabbing this out of the air?
I don't know. I really don't know, and I don't know enough about how that stuff works to speak on it in an educated manner. I will say this, that as somebody who is generally knowledgeable about tech and how it works and software and the different pitfalls that you could fall into when it comes to all that stuff, I would be really reluctant to trust a company that doesn't have a real track record and just sort of came out of nowhere and said, "Hey, we figured out how to do this. Give us $8.99." And we'll, but then they got shut down 24 hours later.
Yeah, but didn't it come back online? Some people I thought were saying, well, it's still working, or it's not dead yet, or I don't know.
I think they figured out a way to get it back. I'm not sure exactly how that worked, but it was like there was like a week or so in between times. And I think that also from a self-preservation standpoint, if I'm going to potentially steal the intellectual property of a company, and I'm basically a startup company, Apple is probably not the company I want taking me to court.
That is one company I would not want to be on the other side of in a legal proceeding. And
no. Just
because they found a way to reverse engineer it doesn't mean that they couldn't possibly be violating something else. Maybe there's a terms of service in a user license agreement. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there could be anything. There could be other stuff I don't know about telecommunications law. I don't know, but I'd be very wary about pioneering that service.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. The first time they did it, it's kind of like, okay, we figured out how to do this. And then, Tim Cook said no. And if they would have been like, okay, and sort of slunk away with their tails between their legs,
issued some refunds and, no harm, no foul.
Yeah, they probably would have been okay. But they doubled down on it by coming back the next week and doing it again. So I have the feeling that the more that they do this, the more that they are running the risk of running afoul of a company like Apple, who, and a lot of people will say, well, Apple stole the graphic user interface
for the Apple Watch keyboard.
But also like their original Mac OS graphical user interface was based heavily on something they saw at Xerox PARC, with something that Xerox was developing. I don't think Xerox's product ever became a viable product, but Steve Jobs saw that. And so the story goes, saw it, was inspired by it, went back to Apple, said, "Hey, we have to do this. Let's figure out how to do it."
Well, there's a rich history in the technology world about finding things that might not have been a finished product, or maybe somebody hadn't gone public yet, and then somebody else is like, "Ta-da, I did it." And then it's like, well, how did you get here? Did you take this? There's just so much crazy stuff. But at the end of the day, Microsoft
did the same thing with DOS. DOS was an open platform, but Microsoft figured out how to sort of build their Windows program off of off of that. So, I mean, there's all kinds of little gray areas and places where companies have taken at best like poetic license with other people's ideas and then taking them forward. I mean, everybody talks about the iPod not being the first MP3 player. It's like, well, no, it wasn't. In tech, as in many things, it's not what's first that
It's what's
matters.
best.
Oftentimes, it's what's the best.
Yeah.
And Apple has consistently come up with the best version of existing products and become very successful in the marketplace doing that. So yes, it's a little ironic that now there's the little software company is trying to leech off them. But
Yeah, and so we've so as a foundational aspect, I think we probably touched on what the concerns are, but like why do people care so much? Like
yeah,
why do people I mean, this is just a prompt so we could get started. I mean,
yeah,
I have my own thoughts and feelings on why people want access to it, but yeah, everybody is just so for this little guy beeper, and just like, look, we absolutely have to have iMessage on our Androids. Talking about it is almost like it's a right, like you should
yeah,
have it. Whenever it's not quite the case at all.
yeah. I put out a tweet that basically said, to the effect that, this was, the theft of Apple's intellectual property, and by that count, it didn't seem like Beeper was in the right. And somebody responded something to the effect of, it's a communication system and we should have access to it. As though it's like in the Bill of Rights or some sort of thing like
Oh
that.
yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
a
Definitely.
constitutional law that we have access to. I mean, and to me, that like I'm gonna be generous and guess that the person that made that comment is very young and not very
And doesn't yeah.
knowledgeable about the way things work in the world. I like Telecommunications has never been a public utility. It's always been it's always been owned by somebody else. The infrastructure, the services, all of it's always been owned by someone else. I'm old enough to have lived through when Ma Bell, which was a huge conglomerate of all the different telecommunications companies in different regions and all that kind of stuff, uh, were broken up by the U.S. government as a monopoly
Hmm.
because
Or even
they,
when Microsoft got broken up.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it used to be that there was no competition in telephone service, so they could charge what they wanted and provide whatever service they felt like. And so it's never been an inalienable right to have access to a service. And now it sounds like the EU is maybe winning against Google and their Play Store because the Play Store has a monopolistic hold on Android apps. And a lot of times the conversation about that has been in relation to Apple having a monopoly on apps for the iPhone and the iPad and other devices that have apps. The thing that I've always fallen back on with Apple is that Apple's a vertically integrated system, right? And so you have to ask to come in, and then once you get in, yeah, you're there, but it's their rules, right? And I guess so. This is the Epic Games thing that I think I haven't really studied up on it, but I did see the headlines yesterday or the day before that the EU had sided with Epic Games in terms of the Google Play Store being a monopoly. I don't know all the details, so I'm just going to leave it there as like a broad thing. But the one reason that I could see that argument is that Android is not a vertically integrated system that runs on only on Google's hardware for up and down the platform, right?
Hmm.
Android is, for all intents and purposes, open source software.
Yep.
Google owns the App Store or controls the App Store,
Hmm.
as far as I know. So I can see how somebody who's using Android and not using a Pixel could make the argument that while they might have licensed the software from Google, if they still do that, I do believe there's some sort of licensing agreement that you have to go into when you make an Android phone. I could see how each individual company might want to have their own app store. Now, Google doesn't say you can't do that.
No, I mean, like in Samsung, even they have their own app store. I mean, there's a pretty good history. There are
Yeah,
a lot of other companies out there that have their own app stores.
right. Yeah. I think Epic Games, if I understand it correctly, and I'm sure somebody will correct me in the comments very politely if I'm wrong, but I believe Epic Games wants it to work more like a PC, where you can basically load an app from an unaffiliated site.
Yeah, so it was very difficult with them because they were trying to circumvent like the 30% share that they were having to give to Apple, which is part
Right.
of the terms of service for hosting their app on the App Store within like so there's not a right. So there's
Right.
no right for them to be able to host their game on the App Store on Apple. So as part of an agreement to enable them to host it and people to download and install it, they were required to do that. But here's the problem and like talking about with Google, there's a way around that with the Play Store. Like you can
Right.
download the Epic Game Store, whereas on Apple you cannot do that. You cannot
Right.
side load it and run a third party app on there. So effectively, it shut off the entire iOS platform because Epic Games is like, we're right, and Apple's like, you're not, and you no longer have access to our app store.
Right.
So it was very. There was a lot of people that were for it on both sides, but it just gets a little sticky because when you look at it and you look at Google and the open source, like we were talking about, which you
Right.
can basically kind of do whatever you want to an extent, is different, even though the experiences very well mirror themselves from
Right.
Apple to Android because that's just how the common UI is that we use now. But it's not the same
Right.
underlying.
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, there's a long history of all this stuff, kind of being a gray area, but the question being, why do people who have Android phones want iMessage? And the funny thing to me is all of the external discussion seems to imply that that's what is behind this. Like, but when you talk to people who use Android phones, they say, I don't care about iMessage. I don't want iMessage. And so I try and figure this out. And some people have tried to have explained certain things, like, if you have to SMS message somebody from who's on an iPhone from an Android phone, and you want to exchange video or whatever, you get
Or high
potato
resolution
yeah,
images or whatever.
yeah, you get very low quality transfer of that. And since iMessage, that was one of its big things, it allowed for high quality sending of images and photo and video and all this other stuff. But if you're on an Android phone and you're getting something from an iPhone and it's coming through SMS, it's sort of the reverse problem. You're the Android user is then going to get the poor quality image, right?
Well, I
And
think it
so,
works both ways, but it's I understand, and I think we need to have a uniform internet-based messaging protocol. And like
yeah,
Google now has RCS,
yep,
and one nice thing is Apple has said they're going to support RCS in 2024 at some point in time. So that should alleviate some of this points of pain when it comes
right,
to sending a video file or sending a text message or being included in group messages. But what
right,
it will not fix is likely the whole green bubble, blue bubble. It'll likely still show up with whatever the green bubble is, but it will work or it should work
yeah.
in theory. So I, I advocated a long time ago Apple should just charge like $4 a month for the syncing iMessage for people who want to license it on Android, and they could just monetize it like they do everything else.
Yeah, and a friend of mine messaged me and was talking about that being a possibility as well. Like, why doesn't Apple charge $9 a month instead of Beeper for that service? And I guess my question being, well, would they still be able to provide the same level of security? Would the Android users have to sign up for an Apple ID? Like, would it be a standalone app? Would it integrate with another app? another messaging app.
It, it,
Like
it
it seems like there's a lot of questions, right?
oh yeah, it raises a lot of issues because ultimately Apple wants to take care of their ecosystem. They want to take care of their customers. They want to maintain their high level of security. And when you have your own closed operating system and you have your own closed network, you can do that.
Right.
Android has been long well known for being much more difficult to secure, easier to exploit, and different things to lock down. So they would probably not be able, or if they could probably to a certain extent offer similar levels of security, but it would create a lot of work for Apple.
Yeah, and I feel like it would require a certain level of partnership with the different manufacturers of the different Android phones, right? Because Samsung has their own version of security and Google has their own version of security. And I don't know how those things might, be walled gardens of their own,
Hmm.
or if they,
Well, I
because
mean, just
Android,
the issue the other day, I used Signal for quite a while because it was supposed to be very secure and encrypted and all the other crazy stuff. And I think they even got exploited or broken into somehow a few weeks ago. I'm like, well, there goes another one.
yeah,
So the thing is, things are believed to be secure until they aren't, and then
right,
I mean, it's like a black eye on your reputation because you're like, well, somebody got in.
yeah. But a closed system is always going to be more secure than one that's open ended the way that Android is. I mean, that's the reason why back in the day people would always be like, "Oh, there are no viruses for Macs, but you're
Oh
at
yeah,
risk."
your PC computer's just riddled with malware and phishware, like all sorts of
Yeah,
crazy stuff. It's like you're like, oh, you got 4 Trojans on your computer, you don't even realize it.
yeah, and the thing is, like, I think that the proliferation of malware and viruses and stuff for Apple products has risen. I just don't think it's ever going to rise to the level that it did with Windows, because if you're open source, then everybody's potentially got the keys to the back door,
Yep.
right? And there's probably 1,000 different ways every day of the week
Well,
to
that's the big
walk through
thing
that back
is
door.
if you can manipulate the software on your end and do other things with it, then that means you can get to the core of the software.
Right.
And that's ultimately the big problem because a lot of that stuff is secured behind a lot of gates. And then you look at you've got the Titan chip inside the Google Pixel. You've
Yep.
got like all sorts of different ways that Android manufacturers try and go about making um, it's called a secure kernel is
Yeah.
basically the core of the system, trying to keep it secure on their individual phone. And that was one reason I was so pro BlackBerry for so long is because they were secure end to end. You could encrypt the stinking phone. I mean, you could do all sorts of stuff, and I love that. But ultimately, Android won out and BlackBerry lost out because they wouldn't give that up for convenience. And
Yeah.
that was really what Google was so big about. Was like, oh, you got to give them access to everything. And all these permissions, all of these things you had to give them access to on your phone just to like load a calculator, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, though, social media and apps really and convenience really killed that platform.
It's interesting too, though, because I mean, I look at BlackBerry and Apple, at least in the way that their businesses were built, as being very similar. I mean, BlackBerry was a closed system
Mhm.
that developed their own operating
And they had
system.
BBM, and everybody BBM was all the rage back in the day. But it's not
Yeah.
like, oh, BBM is a right. We have to have this on every other phone.
Well, it wasn't even like a question at the time, because a BlackBerry was so different than its contemporary dumb phone of the day, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's like you've got people using this full keyboard, QWERTY, like basically smartphone, and then you've got like a flip phone from LG with the T9 typing, and you're trying to
Yeah,
type like hit the T button, the number 8 3 times for
yeah,
T.
yeah, yeah. It's so I think that it was just not like, nobody thought like, why can't we have BBM on our Moto Razor?
Yeah.
Because
Hey, you
but
had the ringtone app store. Gosh darn it.
and that was the funny thing. Like, there was really sort of a have and have not kind of thing back then. Like, Blackberries were almost exclusively considered, like, if you're a business person, then a BlackBerry is for you. If you're just a regular pleb, and you just need the smartphone or the flip phone or the brick phone,
I tell
and
you
and
what, but there were companies that tried to clone them. I mean, Nokia had the blackjack, and they tried to emulate it, but still, it's like, okay, we've got a QWERTY keyboard, but it's still running this really crap interface that's completely janky and useless.
yeah.
So, I mean, there's always people that try to copy, always people that try and emulate, and if you're first, somebody else is always going to try and copy you.
And if I remember, like Palm was the most successful at giving you a BlackBerry like experience on their more higher end phones
And the
because
stylus.
because Palm had existed as like a PDA before,
Well,
right?
it made
So
sense because that was one of the big limitations with the Palm was, okay, I've got my day planner, but I have no connectivity when I take it anywhere.
right,
It's basically like, okay, it's a closed loop experience.
right,
So by building out your Palm into also a phone, like essentially a smartphone at the time, and giving you a keyboard to type on, it made a lot of sense. And you had the Palm, the Centro, the Palm Pre. I had one of those. I thought it
yeah.
was a pretty neat phone.
I had a Palm. It was like a brick phone, like kind of like the Nokia, uh, the really popular Nokia of those days, sort of candy bar style phone.
Hmm.
Um, Palm had one that was like that, but it was a little bit shorter and it had like tiny QWERTY keyboard on it. And
The
I
worst
had I
one,
had that one. Yeah.
I had a Windows. You remember Windows phones? We had Windows CE Compact Edition,
Yeah.
and I had one of those by some company. I can't remember. It was like Daewoo or something. It was some weird, uh, like known brand, but not really a phone brand.
Yeah.
And that thing sucked. It was an AT&T exclusive. And I kid you not, I would have to hard reset that phone like 3 times a day.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate where we're at now compared to where we were at like 20 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, so we AT&T had the iPhone exclusively through the iPhone 4 or was it the iPhone
I
5?
I wanna say the iPhone 4 is whenever it became available on Verizon, because that was the thing too. I had, like, Sprint,
Yeah.
and I had T-Mobile, and I couldn't well, here's the thing, I didn't really want an iPhone. I'm gonna be upfront about that, but I got frustrated with BlackBerry because you could get an iPhone 3G or 3GS, and it's like you finally got 3G internet on your phone. And I was still sitting there using like 2G internet on my BlackBerry Pearl that I had. So I was like, you guys really need to upgrade this stuff. So um, I bought my first iPhone, and the only reason I got it is because I was deployed. I was deployed to Kyrgyzstan in 2010, and there basically wasn't a good way to keep in touch with my family while I was gone. Like I knew I was going to have Wi-Fi where I was
Right.
going,
Yeah.
so I bought an iPhone so I could use an app called Text Now, which basically created a texting phone number that I could use and just send messages back home, and I could text with my family.
Right.
So I used it for the 8 months while I was deployed, and then I came back and I ditched it and I went back to BlackBerry, just because I needed that feature while I was gone. But there was there were some growing pains towards the end with BlackBerry, and then ultimately all that happened with that. Like we don't need to go into that, but yeah, just kind of winding it back down.
Yeah.
A lot of people really do think that they should have a right to this, and I'm of the mind that I think we need a standardized communication platform, but I don't think that people should just have access to it just because it exists and it's cool.
Yeah. I think RCS now has enough parity with iMessage that if you're talking about functionality, then okay, RCS and iMessage are on the same playing field, so that's fine. But ultimately, like, and everybody claims they don't want iMessage, but yet we still talk about how everybody wants iMessage.
Yeah, they don't want an iPhone, but they want iMessage. I'm like, well, I
If you
get that you want that and you think you should have access to it because it's should be like making a phone call or like
Yeah,
sending a text message, but it's something that Apple created and it's on their platform. So use WhatsApp, use Telegram, use BlackBerry Messenger, which I still use, which you can download and pay for. And there's like all sorts of ways around it that aren't it. It's just the only thing I say about it is it's really convenient because it's baked into Apple.
Yeah.
Like that's what your text message icon is, and it really does so much. It's very robust.
Yeah.
And you can send Apple Pay, you can send money across it to somebody, you
Yeah.
can send a PDF to somebody on iMessage. So it's really cool. But if you want it, then get an iPhone. I mean,
Yeah. At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to, and that's what nobody wants to hear. I know John Prosser made a video where he basically said that. I've said it for the last several weeks as we've talked about this. It's like, if you want the Apple experience, then buy the Apple hardware, right? Because it's the same thing as somebody saying like, well, I want FaceTime, but I don't want an iPad, an iPhone, a Mac, or whatever, right? It's like, well, okay, that's fine, but you
I
get to use Google Meet.
I could understand, like, I could understand if you're looking at the two and you're like, okay, they couldn't communicate, but you can. You can send a text message, you can make a phone call, you can communicate. It's
Yeah,
just all the extras. And that's like somebody sitting at home drinking tap water saying, well, I think I should have Evian water for free.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's like, well, you're not prohibited from being able to communicate with somebody who's using iMessage or vice versa.
right.
You can send a text message. You can send a video. I mean, granted, it will look like crap, but I mean, if you want to have an elevated experience, we're going to be 2024 in what 2.5 weeks.
Yeah,
Pretty much
and,
everybody that has a smartphone knows how to use some other messaging platform to get around that.
and that's the thing. Like, I think once Apple supports RCS, maybe a lot of this noise goes away. But as you said, I never understood the blue bubble, green bubble thing.
There
I
will
mean,
still be people that are going to complain about it. Like you, like me, I'd be like, hey, that's great. I can send like RCS and iMessage communicating. I am happy with that. That's
yeah,
a victory. Like that's a big victory. I mean, even Google has been calling Apple out over the last year, like you guys need to adopt RCS, and I get it. Like it makes sense at a base level for people to have enhanced communication. I think that that's a good thing in the year 2023, 2024. But you're still going to have people who have their cake and want to eat it too, and then they'll be like, "No, I need to have it needs to be exactly the same."
yeah. And it comes down to a level of entitlement that I just don't know if I understand. And maybe it comes down to like this baked in a sense of like American exceptionalism, where we feel like we should have the best of all the things because we're the best of everything else. Like, and I'm not saying that because
Maybe
everybody
we
in the
should take a
United
look at our
States.
schools and then like compare them to ones in Europe.
Yeah, don't even get me started, man. It's like I ran for school board twice, and the decisions that they make about schools are terrible.
I was
Um,
homeschooled.
yeah, I'm starting to wish
I never
I'd
went to public
homeschooled
school.
my kid. Yeah, the thing is, like, I think the idea, I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I think
Yeah,
that the idea of public education was a brilliant idea, right?
absolutely.
Not Benjamin, John Adams came up with this idea that, like, hey, if we educate everybody and if we want to be a democracy, we need to educate everybody so that they can make educated decisions about the people that they elect for, their leadership, right?
Well, I
Because
mean, everybody should also have like the universal right to having an education, learn how to read, learn how to write, learn how to like all those
yeah,
things. Like I think that that's very important.
yeah, I do too. And I mean, especially now that there are so many different opportunities and the internet has like sort of broken the door wide open for exploring all kinds of different interests. But the idea for me of public education was, educate the mass public so that they can, think critically and make critical thinking decisions about things
Informed
that will
decisions.
impact their lives, right?
Yeah.
Right. And unfortunately, starting in the early 20th century and then moving forward to now, the systemification of how we run public schools has altered the outcome.
Well, ultimately, the ends justifies the means, and I get very frustrated because you look at people that they graduate out of high school, and then you got to take 3 remedial classes to get to collegiate level because they're just trained to go through the process to pass a test
Yeah.
and not learning how to think.
Yeah. And So my university, West Virginia University, just had to go through a whole process where they eliminated a lot of their programs. They weren't getting funding from the government, and their enrollment numbers were, so the state government, it's Republican government, and they have cut funding to the state university and all this other stuff. So they were running at a huge deficit, hadn't met enrollment goals, et cetera, et cetera. So they cut almost exclusively. They cut liberal arts programming. They have no language programs now.
That's terrible. Like I have an associate. I have an associate's in English. I have an undergraduate minor in English. Like I've got like almost 40 hours of college level English. Like language arts programs, I think are very important.
Yeah. And to me, so I sort of made my own liberal arts curriculum when I was in college. And then I've taught at liberal arts colleges, like small liberal arts colleges that don't let you take like major specified classes until after your second year. So you have to take a general curriculum of liberal arts courses until your junior year, when you can specialize. And the one thing that liberal arts has always done has taught people how to contextualize themselves in the world and be able to think critically about what's going on with them, right? Where they are in the world, and how the forces of the world are impacting them. And so that to me is the value of higher education, right? I think for the past 70 years, we've treated higher education as a vocational school. Mm-hmm. And there are certain professions that need higher education in order to be, so being an attorney, being a doctor, these kinds of things. Yeah. So stop it. I don't know why it's doing this. I didn't tear the whole thing. I'm going to have to tear the whole thing apart and see what's wrong with it. But there are some specialties that need like extended education.
Yes.
But it used to be that you could graduate from high school with enough critical thinking in your curriculum that you could go out and do the same thing that I learned how to do by going to college and sort of picking. What is that?
I don't know. Like a thumbs up thing just came up on your screen and froze.
No idea what that was. But it's not that anymore. And it started with the Industrial Revolution, and there's a whole sort of breakdown of how many managers versus how many workers you need to run a factory.
Well, remember the big revolution back in the 90s and the early 2000s was get a business degree. Everybody get a business degree. And then they all got out and everybody had the same degree but knew how to do nothing.
Yeah.
Like, but I got a business degree.
Like, what do you know? I can run a business as long as you can tell me how to come up with the idea for one, because I didn't take any liberal arts classes and I don't know how to think for myself.
I think there's a place for all of it. I mean, I didn't know that this was supposed to devolve into the Painfully Honest Education podcast, but I mean, as two people who have higher education degrees and have spent a lot of time in the system, I think that there's a big value in being able to think for yourself, understand your place in the world, and be able to apply yourself. And being able to do that is, you can take that anywhere. Now, there's always hard work, and that's where a lot of people get bogged down. Is like, look, inherently, does math come to me? No, it does not. But if I sit there and I do it and I apply myself, like I can get through it. But it doesn't mean I like it. But as long as you have like the core building blocks and you're determined to do something, I think that people should be able to do that and should be taught to do that.
Yeah, I agree. It's just sort of a shame that the purpose of public education has been altered over the course of the decades now, and I don't think that people really recognize it. And having run for that office, to be on the school board, I know that there are tons and tons of well-meaning parents out there who want their kids to be prepared for life. And the hardest thing about liberal arts study, is that you can't really quantify it. You can't say, okay, I can test for this, because it's a cumulative kind of education, right? So like when I worked at the med school and I was teaching creative writing, I oftentimes had to try and explain to people who were doctors or whatever, like, why is this valuable to the medical student? Well, the medical student gets all kinds of instruction and education about how the body works and how disease works and how, the chemistry of it all and all that kind of stuff. But on the core level, what kind of job does a doctor do?
We treat people.
It's a customer service position, right? And if you go through your entire education and never learn how to interact and empathize with people,
how good of a doctor are you being?
Yeah. And especially when medicine has become so systematized and so much, based on outcomes in terms of number of patients seen and number of dollars billed and all this other stuff, where does the person come in? And the only way that you can learn empathy is by hopefully having parents that show it to you, but also by reading books and learning about the world and history and all that kind of stuff, so that you have that glue that sticks all that other extraneous, very specific knowledge together.
Well, you're learning from other people's experiences.
Yeah.
And learning their thoughts and their feelings and just applying that stuff to how you see it, how it applies to you and the world around you.
Yeah. So I don't know how we got here from iMessage.
Well, we went from basic right of iMessage to the basic right of education, but
yes,
it's people are here for the long run. Like they're here for the ride, I think, at this point.
Yeah. If you're still here, we could go anywhere and somehow find our way back. But we did want to talk a little bit about AI, because AI has been percolating all year, right? And it's advanced in many different ways. I don't think that from a 10,000 foot view, what ChatGPT was in January looks very different to what ChatGPT is now to the average person who doesn't know much about it. But yet it's like AI is slowly, or maybe not slowly, quickly everywhere. Like now when I go to my Google search page, there's AI generated results there for me whenever I search for something,
It's built into your phone. It's built into your recommendations. So AI has been proliferating in phones for the last couple of years under the surface. And It's been doing things like text prediction and it takes knowledge that it has acquired. And then it looks at what you're doing in that skill set and says, okay, this is what I think you're trying to do. And the idea was to try and get you places where you're trying to go based off of what you're looking for, what you're trying to do. And now you can create end products with it. So it's not just, okay, let me take what I've learned and tell you what I think. Now it's saying, okay, I've learned so much. Tell me what you want, and I'll try and give it to you. It's kind of what ChatGPT is. And ChatGPT is not AI incarnate. It is a method of AI that somebody's created with these different learning models. So as we go forward, it's being used for a lot of things. Like you and I were talking about before the show, like there's this guy apparently who's created a YouTube channel who got 50,000 subscribers in like a year on teaching people how to use AI to write books.
Yeah. Mainly fiction too, which to me is, I have having a degree in the writing of fiction, using AI to generate fiction seems wrong. I'll just say it. Seems wrong. I can see how generative AI can be a supportive tool, right? But I don't think it should be meant to make, quote unquote, make your job as a writer easier, because writing fiction is not easy. And it's a very personal expression, right? So it seems weird to me. And that sort of illustrates the slippery slope that we are going to encounter with AI, because we've already talked about it with art, right? And YouTube already has some guidelines about when you have to tell people that things are generated with AI or with the assistance of AI.
Well, that's been a big problem with this. They call it deep fake stuff, because you've probably seen it if you're on TikTok, if you're on YouTube watching YouTube Shorts, if you're on Instagram Reels, and you see where it's like somebody's using their face imposed on somebody else's, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and they're like talking like them, which get out of here. Like we could do
Yeah.
that, but
Yeah.
like it's an AI that's doing it for you, and like or making you look like somebody, or they're cutting and pasting or using AI to have somebody say like a speech of something, and it seems like it's
Yeah.
very real, but it's
Yeah.
not. So there's a lot of boundaries that are really being stretched with certain types of AI that are tearing at the fabric of what's real versus what's not. And there's not
Yeah.
necessarily tools to determine what is or isn't real.
Yeah. I mean, and that can have repercussions, both personal, like, think of the damage that you could do with like with pasting somebody's face, like, oh, you've got a girl at school that you don't like. And so you just put her face on, like, Pornhub.
Well, that's happening.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
people
I
are
know.
doing that. And I mean, it's crazy. There's actually, from what I've read, not my personal experience, but there are apparently OnlyFans accounts that are generated from AI, not even a real person,
Yeah,
making like $10,000 a month, and it's not even real.
I
I'm
know.
like, it's crazy.
Well, it's kind of like the whole, like, hentai phenomenon, where there are some people who are like so into that style of art, and it is kind of like a quasi sexual thing to them.
Mhm.
And this is like the next natural extension of that. It's like,
Yeah,
doesn't even matter if it's real.
and we're not doing that on the Google Pixel, by the way. Like, so this is kind of a stem over from last week's discussion, because we're talking about some of the cool things that AI is doing for the Google Pixel phone, because it's supposed to be the smartest smartphone, or if they've
Right.
coined that phrase, somebody has anyway. It's floating around there. But it's cool because one of their kind of big things, their big competitor to like Chat GPT, is their Project Gemini, which
Right.
they've got Gemini, like Gemini Pro, Gemini Nano, which is the one for the phone.
Right.
Because there are limitations for phones. Like, as powerful as your system on a chip is, it can only do so much. And historically, we're not really programmed to handle these AI computations.
Right.
So the Google Tensor 3, the G3, was built from the ground up to have a lot of extra power to handle AI tasks. So it does a lot of things on the phone without even requiring the internet, like voice to text, or translating things, or using your translator app, or like there's a lot of things that can do, but it has limitations. So if someone's like, oh, well, it doesn't completely do everything on the phone with the video boost, or it doesn't do everything on the phone with the Magic Creator or Magic Editor, I'm like, okay, we need to have another discussion here, because there's two different components to AI in smartphones. There's edge AI, which is the AI that's done in your phone.
Right.
It's like the leading tool that generates like the building blocks and sends the instructions off to the cloud AI. Because
Right.
Google and other places have these big, massive servers offsite that are better equipped to handle those tasks.
Right.
So it starts on the phone and really big things and sends it there, and then it sends back the finalized product. Maybe it takes a second, maybe it takes 5 minutes, whatever. But that's kind of how it's like a reciprocal relationship. You have
Right.
the platform AI, edge AI, and then you have cloud AI. So the Google Tensor 3, we just got the whole project. We got Gemini Nano added on there. And what it gave us was AI prediction for smart replies built into the Messages app and Gboard. And we also got, it's doing summaries of the Recorder app. So if you use a recorder, you have different people talking, it'll give you a chat summary of like the stuff that you talk about. So it's just adding more and more things as we go. And that's some of the cool things that AI can do in a contextual and a practical way on the phone.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it's going to be I think 2024 is going to be very interesting, because, I mean, as YouTubers, we've heard all this discussion about how AI is like a niche that, you could get in on the ground floor and build a build a niche for yourself in that space. And obviously this guy who has the channel about writing fiction has found a niche and people who are interested in it. I mean, because probably 90% of the people on the planet have like some dream of theirs to write the great American novel, or write a fantasy series or something like that. So this puts it maybe a little bit more within their reach.
Well, a lot of people may not have experience with it, or they may not have the native ability, and they want to try and learn or want a starting point. You can do that with Chat GPT right now. You can go
Yeah.
there and type in to say, "Give me a story about a traditional suburban family that's married, and then it's in the 1940s with the threat of the atomic bomb, dropping or whatever, and give me
Yeah.
a 500-page story sample."
Right.
And it'll do that. It'll give you like a 500-page like script of like of that story synopsized in synopsis, and then you can be like, okay, expound on this and make it 2,000 words, and you're like, all
Right.
right, make this 4,000 words, and then then you can go in and just build everything out. You could write a book, like you could
Yeah.
do it.
I think it is interesting, like in the sense of, okay, so like the last couple of books that I've written have been mysteries, right? And mysteries are very formulaic. So it would be interesting to me to maybe throw some prompts into generative AI to say like, okay, give me an outline in like 12 chapter mystery format of a story where these are the players and this is the thing that happens, and and just see what comes out, because I know I've done this with AI for like trying to generate blog posts from scripts or from YouTube videos or something like that, where instead of just copying and pasting like the description that you have from your YouTube video to like put your video on your web page, you could actually like generate a blog post from the script, right? And
You can write apps with this stuff. You can be like,
yeah,
here, give me a code, give me a line of code for this, or like, here, write this out for me for this module for my program, or like connect this to this using like. There's so many different ways that you can use it. Like, I think the sky is the limit, and a lot of it is not so much what it can and can't do. It's understanding how to talk to it to get the output that you want.
yeah. Where we should really be scared is once it starts deciding on its own. But
Yeah. Well, when did Skynet go active? Wasn't it like
it's
when
like,
was
wasn't it 2024? I can't remember exactly.
Skynet activation day? It was supposedly went online August 4, 1997.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah. Well,
we're long past that. Um,
yeah.
but I mean, one day it's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. Like, I think there's an uncanny valley in our thinking of like what the potential for AI really is, because our brain, for all intents and purposes, is a generative AI machine, right?
Yeah.
It it works in such a way that it lets you extrapolate on inputs and make decisions based on what that extrapolation is.
Well, I mean, ultimately, your brain is a computer, and it's
Yeah.
like operates on ones and zeros the same way. And you interact with experiences, and you gain intelligence and education from just how you interact with the world. And like, okay, this is bad, this is good,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you've got a chemical reward center in your brain that makes you like things.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, and I think one of the big things as a creator, as you and I are, we create content for folks. The lines I think start to get blurred, because if a machine is giving us all the information to tell our audience, what kind of experience are you getting at that point? Because I am very much of the mindset that like I'm creating information, a human based experience here based off of what I've done, not a computer telling me what I should tell you because that's what you're searching for.
Yeah. So I'm also a big true crime fan. I've been a true crime
Oh yeah, I
fan
like the
for a long,
shows.
and so I've wanted to have a true crime YouTube channel or something like that. But that I've watched enough and listened enough and read enough books about different cases and everything that like I'm relatively conversant on a lot of different true crime cases, right? So if I wanted to make, like, my idea is to start out with like a shorts channel about like different true crime events, right? Here's how I envision myself using AI to help me get that channel started. I go to the AI and I say, give me an outline of all the events, including names, dates, and places for the crimes of such and such person up until they were arrested, and then give me the outcome of their arrest. Something along those
Well,
lines.
that makes sense because that's going to save you hours upon hours of having to go out and find it. It's just going to
Right.
catch the information that you need and filter it and give it back to you. So that way you can go, okay, I've got all the building blocks that I need here, but you didn't create the building blocks. You just found the information that you needed.
Yeah, and that way, like if I'm doing something that's a minute or 2 minutes long or whatever, I can then just sit down and tell the story, but have like all of the correct names, dates, places, et cetera, right in front of me, as opposed to having to do all that. Now, is that cheating? I would say no, because I'm asking it for this because I've already familiarized myself with the material, right?
Mhm.
And so I'm not asking it to write me a script that I'm going to read word for word. I'm asking for the outline of the events that I can then use as a way to guide my storytelling.
Well, it's just like earlier when I was talking about how there was a big revolution in the education system about how everybody was trying to get business degrees back in the year 2000. If I want to go back and say, okay, what year did the business degree become like the prominent major that students were looking for in college, and when did that end?
Right.
And I could be like, okay, so back in 1997, this really took off, and then everyone I knew was doing it, and then we found
Yep.
that ultimately it was a terrible idea.
Yeah.
So, but it gives you those foundational building blocks, so the steps that help you create the content that you're creating,
Yeah.
which is unique and helpful.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing about something like I think AI will very quickly become a second brain for people, right? And we'll very quickly learn how to interact with an AI to augment and accent our what we already natively know. So if you got a business degree back in the year 2000, but you didn't know much about like actually starting a business, or you knew the steps, but you didn't have the organic wherewithal to go through and do it, maybe the AI is like your partner in this venture, right?
I think a lot of people envision it being much like, and this is like something I think most people can relate to at this point, is Tony Stark and his Jarvis that
Yeah.
he had. And I think that's really what a lot of people are envisioning this being, is like a personal assistant in some ways. I mean, there's gonna be different manifestations, but I mean, there will be some sort of personal assistant where you're like, oh, do this, do that, or do this calculation for me, make this for me. And you'll be able to tie it in with, like, you can probably tie it in with a 3D printer. It's like, hey, 3D print me like a model for this,
Right.
or an arc reactor, or uh, make reservations for my appointments for the next week,
Right.
based off my schedule, and and order me a pizza on Wednesday. Like it's all these crazy
Yeah.
things you'll be able to do, and even some of them in some ways we can do now. But I think probably in the next 5 to 10 years we don't even recognize what it is like right now. Like, this is very infantile stages of shaping what it is going to be.
And I think much as we don't recognize how AI is helping us inside the technology that we already use, I think that generative AI will kind of become invisible in its own way.
Well, the
And
best technology you have is the most seamless technology, and that's
yeah,
one of the ways that the Apple with their products, they found ways to allow you to do so much and to make it a simple and seamless process,
right.
and kind of everybody liked that.
And that's one of the reasons why I feel like I know there are plenty of people out there who take really good advantage of the voice assistants that are in their phones, or in the Echo devices that are around their house, or their Google Nest devices, or something like that. But I really believe, like, until it becomes the kind of thing where you can talk to your okay, let's say it's Alexa, right?
Yeah,
Until you can just, like, until that's hooked into everything, and you can just say it, like, in regular contextual speech, like, hey, so yeah, and talk to it normally.
mhm.
That's when, like, widespread adoption will occur. But
But we
when
need
you
to be
have
careful. Like, it's a slippery slope because you don't want to have this AI in your house that you're like, you're watching a football game. You're like, gosh darn it, I hope that Coach Belichick gets hit by a truck. and then like AI enables somebody's car when he's crossing the street to run over. Like there needs to be safeguards.
See, that could be like the reboot of the Final Destination movies, right?
And then
That
foundation
see,
of your book.
yeah. But yeah, no, I mean it's true. There has to be like some kind of directive, but I think because you still have to think pretty hard about how to ask or what you want to ask to a Siri or to a Google voice assistant. Like, since you have to think about it, it's not as natural, right? And so for me, like I just don't use it as much.
I never use those things. I'd rather just Google it myself. I so many things that I guess I could ask my phone. I feel so stupid talking to my phone like, "Hey Google." I'm not going to finish that sentence
Yeah.
exactly. My phone, but you go. It needs to be natural. It needs to be able to pick up on when you're talking to it without having to give it prompts for everything.
Right.
It needs to be faster. It needs to be more built out. But that's one of those things we're talking about. There's generative AI, there's like assistant AI, there's contextual AI. There's so many different levels to this that I think people don't even grasp or
Yeah.
understand at this point. And it's going to be it's going to be crazy.
Well, I think that the place that we're going to see it really push forward more quickly than anywhere else is going to be in our cars, right? Because already we have this huge problem of distracted driving. It's been a problem. It's still a problem, but the car that we got recently, the Bronco, has like Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. And I never used that in a car more than just like for poops
That's
and giggles,
tertiary.
but it shows me the possibility of being able to talk to my phone that is like jacked into the car, that can then like offer a lot more control of things without having to become distracted, pull your eyes off the road,
Oh
et
yeah,
cetera, et
I think
cetera.
the goal is in like 10 years to have fully autonomous cars like uh Demolition Man
Yeah.
or like in iRobot, where basically you don't drive anymore, and it's based like I know there are companies that look at the cars like the next entertainment frontier,
Yeah.
because if you're not driving, what are you doing? Well, then you can catch up on your shows on your way to work, or
Yeah.
if you want to go on a long distance drive, you could take a nap. I mean, there's like just all these different things. So I know a lot of people look at it in different ways, but ultimately that's going to be the next thing in cars is once you don't have to drive it anymore, how can we entertain you or make this drive
Right.
the drive more enjoyable? And that's just gonna like proliferate so many crazy things.
Yeah, and that reminds me of some news that just came out yesterday. Now, I realize that um, Tesla's kind of been taking it in the nads, uh, and Elon in general has been taking it in the nads with the Cybertruck and all that kind of stuff. But yesterday's news was even more impactful, I would have to say, and I was surprised to not see it be a big topic of conversation in the social medias over yesterday and today. But Tesla yesterday had to recall all 2 million Teslas in the US, all of them, to, let's see, I want to make sure that I say this. So this is from CNN. Tesla is recalling nearly all 2 million of the cars on U.S. roads to limit the use of its autopilot feature following a 2-year probe by U.S. safety regulations of roughly 1,000 crashes in which the feature was engaged. So basically, they're over 2 years they've been following this autopilot thing, and I guess at this point they say, it has to be less auto.
Yeah, I'm reading here. It says after the recall, Teslas with auto steer, which is basically autopilot, turned on will more routinely check on the driver's attention level, may disengage the feature, and when the software determines the driver isn't paying attention, when the car is approaching traffic controls, or when it's off the highway, when auto steer alone isn't sufficient to drive the car. So I think there's a fundamental understanding here that a lot of people believe that Autopilot, which I think is a bad word, and I've been saying this because my wife, when she first got her Tesla Model 3,
Right.
she's like, "Oh, Autopilot." I'm like, "But it doesn't really drive for you. It just kind of stays in the lane and manages like
Yeah.
it'll avoid obstacles to an extent. It'll alert you. But it kind of is just glorified cruise control."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the word autopilot really imbues so much more into that, into what you expect. But then there's also full self driving. So,
Right.
like, what is auto? Like, why is one full self driving, one autopilot? But even full self driving doesn't fully self drive. So I'm like, okay, that's also a really dumb name. But the important thing here is when you talk about a recall on a Tesla, like especially in this point in time, you don't have to drive it down to the Dodge dealership. It's just gonna be pushed
Yeah.
out over a software update.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just kind of shocking. You see that word recall and you think of what that traditionally means for motor vehicles,
Oh
which
yeah, it
is
means
like
take it back to the shop.
you got to go back to the shop, you got to get the new part put in. And yeah, Teslas, I mean, are somewhat unique in the sense that so much of what they do is computer based, and they have Wi-Fi attached, and they have cellular attached, and they can just download their updates, right? So
And
it's more like a computer than a car
and
in that sense.
I use autopilot quite a bit. Like when I'm out on the highway, heck yeah, I engage it because it it's not something that I look at as an alternative to driving. It just makes the experience more comfortable. Like you just
Yeah.
sit there, you hold on to it, you kind of look around, but it's not like you're sitting there like this the entire time. It gives you a little bit of more flexibility. Like if you want to change something on the radio, or like you're not worried about you're going to die because you look down for a second.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people have the sense that Tesla's autopilot is somehow different than what a lot of the new cars out there all have something very similar. Different gradations, but I know like Subaru has their own version of lane keeping control.
Yeah, Ford has
And
a nice one. I mean, there's a
yeah,
lot of them now, and they'll do the pacing between other cars. They'll give you an alert. It stays between the lanes.
yeah,
So that's really mostly what it is. I
yeah,
don't never understand why they call it autopilot. I mean, I get you, and then the other thing is like if you do stop paying attention, it can tell if you're like holding your phone up, if you're not looking down, because there's a camera in the cab,
right,
like where your sunglasses visor would traditionally be, and it does monitor your behavior while you're
yeah,
driving. So
yeah,
if it determines that you're not paying attention or you're doing something that's distracting too much or for too long, it'll start beeping or like a little blue flashy light, or it'll disengage. Like it'll be like, and you can't use it anymore. It's
right,
like, okay, you've proven that you're not taking this seriously. So until you stop and start the vehicle again, you can no longer use autopilot.
right.
You've been cut off.
Yeah. I mean, even my Bronco, which doesn't really have too many of those features, but it does have like this lane assist, but it just notices when you're like sort of going in and out of the lane, so it'll like vibrate the steering wheel when it sees that you've hit the white line.
Mine is like those pinball machine robot vacuums. You know,
Yeah.
the ones that have like no laser detection. They just bounce
Yeah.
around, and the whole theory is okay. If it does this for half an hour, it'll mostly clean your room.
Yeah.
That I have like lane detection with my Supra, and if you get too close to that white line, it just kind of pinballs you back into the middle of the lane, and it's like,
Well, I've also had the Bronco when we drove back to West Virginia. Like I have what I call carcolepsy. Like
you get sleepy when you drive.
yeah. And it hits me like within the first half an hour. And if I get past like an hour or so, I'm usually fine. But there'll be like 20 minutes or so of me just kind of like drifting, right? And the car, this is the first time this ever happened. And this is not like a fully loaded car. It has like the very basic technology package, right?
Mhm.
And it was like twice it told me like it seems like you're tired. Maybe you want to take if you want to take a break. And then the third time in red, it was like, you need to pull over now. I was just like, wait a minute, man.
Like, leave me alone.
Yeah. So this is the AI future. But
Hey, I can envision that. Like, imagine like, especially this would be like a regulatory compliance thing, probably. But if your car could tell that you've had too much to drink,
right.
and it's like, nope, you're not driving anywhere, and it's like requires you to pull over and park somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. It
or
just has some sort of passive BAC
yeah.
detector that, I mean,
Or I mean, here's what it maybe it could tell you having a stroke. Maybe it could tell you
yeah.
having a heart attack, and it calls 911 and pulls over to the side. Like, there's a lot of ways that could really make the driving experience safer and better for everybody. But then,
Yeah.
of course, it's going to cut into things like, if you like to drive 15, 20 miles an hour over the speed limit when you're going on a long trip, you might be regulated to the speed limit. And so,
Yeah. I mean, I think that given Americans' relationships with their cars, most of these things would have to be on like under some circumstance defeatable. Like you could turn it off,
yeah.
right? And like, where do you draw the line on that? Because then it's the same argument as like, well, how much do you regulate?
Mhm.
Depending on which side of the political fence you sit on. Like, one side says no regulation, the other side says
Regulate it all.
let's make sure everybody is safe, like, but it's got to be somewhere in between. So it's going to be a very interesting time, but I do think that that's where AI is going to first be most recognizable as its own kind of entity.
Oh,
But
yeah.
like, and so I think that it'll be really interesting when that happens, because I mean, just imagine, mobility is such a huge issue for so many people in the world, right? Like,
Well, it's a big thing in the United States. And a lot of folks, if you take a look at like Europe, don't understand the fascination with driving or people in their cars and the love for the automobile in the United States. But in Europe, you can take a train anywhere.
yeah,
You can take a bus. There's subways in all these major cities. And then you come to the United States and it's like, you mean I got to drive for 8 hours to get somewhere? And there's no other way to get there other than to get an airplane, which might not even fly there.
well, I remember I took a train from Pittsburgh to Seattle after my freshman year in college,
That's a nice
and
3-day ride.
it was 3 days. It was 3 days. It was like from Pittsburgh to Chicago, change trains in Chicago, and then you're on the train for like 2.5 days
Yep, to get to Seattle.
on the way to Seattle, right?
Mhm.
And I think that a lot of people who aren't familiar with like the topography of the U.S. Don't quite get it. Like, I was watching this short video earlier today, and this young woman was making a video about how, you know, like, you can't go walk on people's private property like their farmland or something. So where do Americans go to walk? Right? Because on the Isle of Great Britain, like, it's a relatively small place, and most of the land is spoken for, right?
Mhm.
So somebody stitched in with it and showed like all of the federally owned land in
Yeah.
the United States, and basically it's like, yeah, there's some in the East Coast and out toward the Midwest, but then once you get past
The
like the
middle of
Midwest,
the United States, like Kansas.
and then you get into Utah, Arizona, Nevada, like all California, all of those places. Once you get into that, it looks like the majority of the land is owned by the government, and a lot of it is national parks or conservation areas or things like that. But the person made the point that it's really hard for people who don't live in the U.S. or haven't spent a lot of time in the U.S. to understand the scale
Well, let
of
me
the U.S. Like, he pointed out that Alaska is the same size as 7 point something Great Britain's.
Yeah, so I don't think a lot of people realize how, like, it's funny if you pull up a picture of Texas, like, so how big is Texas in comparison to like Western Europe? And it's like it's like half the size. It's
Right.
gigantic. And then Alaska's like twice the size of that.
Yeah.
But so in context, so like Yellowstone. Yellowstone is, I think it's the largest national park. It's bigger than Delaware and Rhode Island combined.
You can enter Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming and California.
Yeah, it's 3,472 square miles of national park.
Like,
And
when I learned that, I was like, somebody was talking about going to Yellowstone National Park and they were in California, and I was like, well, I'd only heard of people like entering in like Wyoming or Montana, so like in that
no, it's stinking
area.
massive.
It's, yeah. So the scope and scale is just so immense, and that's why, I mean, when you think about the world wars, when you think about all that, when you think about all that stuff, like think about fighting a war within like half of Texas, right? Like that seems manageable, right?
Yeah. But when you
But
think about it, like, oh, it took up all of Europe, and you're like, that sounds much bigger.
yeah,
And then you realize that there's states that are like that size. So
yeah. So the two countries that have the most landmass just so happen to be, well, the three countries, I guess, really, that have the most landmass just so happen to be the three most powerful, however you want to judge that, countries in the world. So you've got the US, you've got China, and you've got Russia, not the Soviet Union.
I mean,
Although,
just in context, driving the speed limit to go from the Louisiana border, like on the east side of Texas, to El Paso on the west side of Texas, close to the New Mexico border, 11 hours.
Yeah.
11 hours of straight driving at like 75 miles an hour to get across just Texas.
Yeah. And West Virginia being one of the smaller states, you know, it's in the east where, like, you know, they're all cut up a little bit smaller. It's half of Virginia. So, but to drive from like one end of West Virginia to the other is
3 hours.
It's 6 hours to go from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, that's still a good ways, and that's West Virginia, meaning the smaller Virginia.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The part that Virginia was willing to let go of. Actually, I don't think they were, but the only state ratified as a state in wartime. So, a little West Virginia history for you there. 1862. So
you would know that. Being a resident, I don't know that, but it's probably a good stopping point. I think we've probably reached a logical conclusion to this one.
Yeah, we've started with our topics and we've extrapolated it out to where we can't remember how we started. So
no. We talked about Beeper, we talked about AI,
yeah,
and then we just said a lot of things that we might have some angry comments about.
Somehow we ended up in U.S. geography.
But if you like that sort of thing, we appreciate it, and hope you enjoyed the ride.
Yeah. Come back, and who knows where we'll go the next time, but we'll start out with some topics you might be interested in.
Yes.
So once again, thanks so much, folks, for being here. This is the Painfully Honest Tech Podcast, the podcast so honest it hurts. We'll probably be back in a couple of weeks. But maybe we'll be back before that. I feel like it behooves me to take a little rest, but we'll see. Anyway, until the next time, we're out.